today we are very excited to have Yvonne Giesing and Nadzeya Laurentsyeva, and they are gonna talk about firm left behind, emigration and firm productivity. 45 minutes for the presentation as usual. If you have questions, you can write them in the chat if you are in the webinar, and we'll ask them in the last 15 minutes, and the panel can ask questions whenever they feel like. So thank you for being here. Yvonne, take it away.
Thanks very much for the invitation. And my co-author Nadzeya is also online with us, and she can manage the chat. So the project is called Firms Left Behind, Emigration and Firm Productivity. And the main research question is what happens to firms if a large amount of skilled workers are emigrating. And we are using the setting of the European Union enlargement because we had a sudden large emigration wave. So here on my first slide, you can see how emigration from new member states has increased over time. And you can see in the blue line, that is Bulgaria, Croatia, Czech Republic, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia. These are the origin countries I will be talking about. Emigration has increased a lot, in particular after 2004 and after 2007, when these countries have joined. At the same time, you can see that the migration within the old EU 19 member countries has not experienced such a strong increase. And when I'm talking about EU 19, I mean the old EU 15 countries plus 4 EFTA countries, Switzerland, Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway. So these are our destination countries, and Eastern Europe is our origin countries. And we are interested in what happens to firm productivity in the origin countries when people leave. Actually, there was a large debate around this, and many policymakers, firm managers, etc., have worried about the brain drain following the EU enlargement because many people have had better opportunities and higher wages abroad. If we look at the data, you can also see that it's a brain drain, and it is mostly the skilled people that are leaving. So here on the x-axis, you can see the percentage of population with a completed tertiary education in general. And on the y-axis, you can see the percentage of emigrants with tertiary education for a number of Eastern European countries. And you can see that for most of the countries, the dots are on the left side of the 45-degree line, meaning that those emigrating are more higher educated than those left behind. Now the question is, does this have any effect on firms, and what are the effects on firms? So just some anecdotal evidence from a firm survey shows that following the EU enlargement, so I'm talking about the left side panel here, the firms that told the survey that they are constrained by the factor labor in their production has increased a lot for the new member states. And it's not driven only by some general economic effects, because the increase in the EU 19 has not been that steep. So this is already some anecdotal evidence that firms in the origin countries were worried. In 2009 and 10, when we had the general financial crisis, there was less labor demand in general. So the skill shortages have not been felt so much by firms. But once the economy has recovered, we can see the labor constraints skyrocketing again, and much stronger in new member states than in old member states. And this is not driven by some general product market competition due to enlargement, as you can see on the right side. So this was some anecdotes, some numbers to motivate the topic. The project is trying to estimate now the causal effect between emigration and firm productivity. And the main challenge of the paper is the endogeneity of migration. So of course, there's a number of reasons why emigration is not random. So people are leaving those firms that have lower productivity. So there might be reverse causality. there could be omitted variable bias. So it could be that those firms that have bad management have large emigration, but also have lower productivity. So this is why we designed a new instrumental variable based on changes in EU labor laws following the accession, the transitional provision. And at the same time, if you want to analyze the effects of the firm, there's not a lot of research because there's not many good firm level data sets for origin countries. But in East Europe, we have this advantage that we have a large administrative firm level panel data set for all the countries mentioned, 11 countries. And we also have had to collect a new migration data set because the existing migration data sets did not have sector, and our variation is at the sector level and precise country of origin. So what do we find in a nutshell? We find that the emigration of skilled workers reduces firm productivity, but only in the short run. That is the year of emigration and the following year. We find heterogeneous productivity effects and different adjustment mechanisms for the firm. So we think that it's interesting to look at the firm level and not just at the industry level, because you can see these different effects for different kinds of firms. If we dig deeper to the mechanisms, we find some evidence for skill shortages and reduced training. And this is because the firms have increased turnover. They know that people might be leaving, so they have less incentives to train those people. And in some additional analysis, we show that the effects are much stronger if we have some proxy for positive self-selection of emigration. So most of the people in the audience, I guess, are migration economists, but let me just say one sentence why this is interesting also beyond migration economics. So there is a larger question about the role of human capital for firm performance. And here we have a nice exogenous shock to this human capital. And then we can measure the effect of human capital for firm performance, and we can study how firms adjust if there's an exogenous shock in human capital. So this was the introduction, the motivation. Let me briefly talk about the literature. Many of you have contributed to that, so it's great to present in front of this audience. So there's this general larger literature on the effects of emigration on a number of different outcomes. We have macroeconomic outcomes, we have wages, we have exports. But there's nothing, to the best of our knowledge, there's nothing which really uses firm level panel data and study the adjustment mechanisms at the firm level. And we think it's interesting to have the firm level because you can see how the macroeconomic outcomes are shaped and how it recovers over time. Now, there is a firm level migration research literature, but this has so far studied the effects at the firm level, but for immigration. So it has focused on Israel, France, US, Germany, China, but it has been studying exactly the opposite side. And then there's a literature out of migration, which looks at what happens to firms if workers, for example, die of these skill shortages, and what are the adaptation mechanisms. And they have found, for example, the Jäger paper, that if there's a worker dying, it's not that easy to find a perfect substitute, and the substitutes don't have the same productivity immediately. So how do we contribute to the broader literature? So we think we are the first to analyze the effects with a firm level data set looking at productivity. And we have a new instrument that is based on these transitional provisions in labor laws with the EU enlargement. We think it's interesting to focus on firm productivity because it's one of the best predictors of firm growth, and it shapes the innovation potential, for example, in an economy. It's also interesting, we can look at certain types of firms. So for example, we can look at the innovators and how innovating firms behave differently from other firms. Or we can look at the firms along the productivity distribution we can study if firms that are highly productive behave different compared to firms that are have lower productivity. And this then creates some policy relevant insights about EU enlargement and brain drain. So this is mostly an empirical paper, but I want to provide you some theoretical considerations to guide the analysis. So I'm not presenting any model, I'm just presenting some ideas here. When I'm talking about productivity, there's 3 different potential measures one could have in mind, and they generate different hypotheses. So one measure is labor productivity. This is just simple value added per employee. And this could go down or up due to emigration. It could go down if the best employees are leaving, and those left behind generate less value added. It could also increase if, for example, the number of employees reduces, but the value added stays the same because they are organizing in a better way, they become more efficient. Then there's something, we call it wage-adjusted labor productivity. So this is the value added over employee costs. So here we take into consideration that some workers are highly skilled, have higher wages. So here, wage-adjusted labor productivity could decrease, for example, if labor becomes more scarce in the economy and wages increase. So value added would stay the same, but employee costs would increase, leading to lower labor productivity. There could also be substitution effects. For example, if employees become more scarce, firms change their technology, they use more capital, more machines, and then they produce the same value added with a lower number of employee costs because they have invested in machines. The third measure we are looking at is TFP, total factor productivity. So that is the A in the typical production function. Many people call it the unknown, the rest. And this is calculated by dividing the total output by the weighted average of labor and capital. So this measure takes into account that there are substitution effects going on. And there's also a number of different reasons, and the effects of emigration on TFP could be different depending on the different mechanisms. Most of them would say that TFP decreases. For example, if skilled employees that are leaving had positive spillovers on other workers, and then TFP decreases because these spillovers don't exist anymore. It could also be that people are leaving and the firm takes time to replace those workers, and in the meantime, the production lies idle, and that's why TFP decreases. One channel we actually find evidence for is that due to emigration, there's higher turnover. This reduces firm-specific human capital, which is not that easy to replace with other skilled workers. And new hired people have less incentives to train because of the higher turnover, and this is why TFP decreases. One could also come up with an argument why TFP would increase. And this is due to better technologies, for example, and if firms face more competition, there have been a few papers that show that the technology works better, that they adopt better technologies, better practices. So here I'm not just talking about the capital substitution effect, but better management practices, for example, other technologies. The last part of the theoretical considerations, I want to mention the difference between the firm level and the industry level. So most of our analysis, we use firm fixed effects. So all the arguments, what I'm saying is at the firm level. What happens at an individual firm if there's people leaving? But I also show you regressions for the industry level. And here, the arguments are slightly different because we have to take into consideration that the composition changes. So there's firms that are exiting the industry because of lower productivity, and there might be less firms entering. There's less entrepreneurship. There's also one paper that has shown that. So if there's no questions on the theoretical framework, I will now come to the empirical approach. And as I mentioned, the main challenge is the endogeneity of the migration flow, the omitted variable, bias, or the reverse causality. And let me explain a little bit how we solve this issue. So we are using the EU labor market reforms as a natural experiment. And this has happened following the 2004, 7, and 13 accession. 2013 was just Croatia. And the way it worked is that a couple of destination countries were very worried about a large influx of cheap labor, especially Germany in 2004-5, the sick man of Europe, had very high unemployment rates. And having the border with many of those Eastern European countries, they were extremely worried that this would create additional unemployment. So they have negotiated with the European Commission together with a couple of other countries and said most of the accession policies, such as a free flow of capital or free trade, will happen immediately upon accession. But the free flow of labor will be delayed by up to 7 years if the destination country wishes. And they can actually select certain industries which they want to keep closed. So many different destinations have applied different provisions. So for example, the famous example, the UK opened their labor market immediately, and that's one of the reasons why many Polish people went to the UK, whereas previously they would have gone maybe to Germany. So Ireland, UK, and Sweden opened immediately. Austria and Germany kept their labor markets almost entirely closed for the 7 years. And then there's many other destinations, France, Italy, Netherlands, that opened at some point between 2004 and 2011 for the first accession. And they have also introduced sector variation. And a couple of countries have said we only open sectors where we have skill shortages. So this is like the perfect experiment for us because it shows that there's different emigration opportunities for new member state citizens that are varying at the year, country, and industry level. And we summarize this in an instrument we call free labor mobility. Now, to be a valid instrument, we need the two typical conditions, exogeneity and relevance. So let me speak briefly about the exogeneity. So the decisions to open certain sectors in certain years was done at the destination level, was done by policymakers that were worried about unemployment in the destination country. They could also not apply different rules for different countries. So they had to apply the same rule for Poland, Slovakia, Slovenia, Baltic countries, etc. They could apply different rules to the different entry years, but for the 2004 entries, they needed to apply the same rules. So we think it's extremely unlikely that a single firm in a single origin country could influence the precise sector openings at the destination, which were then applied to all origins at the same time. We also think that it was not really anticipated. It was, of course, anticipated that the country would enter the European Union and that there would be free labor mobility eventually. But it was not anticipated which sector in which destination in which year would open exactly, because this depended on many different things. Now for the relevance, there's a couple of things. So there's a literature that has shown already that migration flows within Europe were determined by these openings and the transitional provisions. But I can also show you later the first stage where we can see that these transitional provisions really affected the emigration patterns following the EU enlargement. How exactly do we create the instrument? So for a given origin industry time, let's say we have Poland, we have the construction sector in 2004. There are 19 potential destination countries. And there's 19 potential industries in these destination countries in 2004 for Poland. And every industry is either opened or closed. So we have 19 dummies that are either 0 or 1. And then we weigh these 19 dummies with the distance between the two countries, because of course it's more important for Romania if Italy opens than if Finland opens. And it's more important for the Baltics if Finland opens than Italy or Portugal. We also weigh it with the reported skill shortages in the destination industries. And there's two reasons for this. The one reason is that a couple of destination countries specifically said we open those sectors where we have skill shortages. The other reason is that there's only emigration opportunities if there's actually skill shortages in the destination countries. For example, in the financial crisis, it was very hard to get jobs anywhere in certain countries that were hit by the financial crisis. So there were no skill shortages, so emigration opportunities were also much lower. Let me show you the first stage.
So Yvonne, sorry, question. Yeah. Are these short industry level shortages year specific? I didn't see the T subscript.
Yeah, did I miss it? Yeah, no, I didn't give it here precisely, but the skill shortages are industry time specific.
Okay, so the goal is to avoid to have a lower value during the Great Recession, essentially, to treat the Great Recession differently from the other years.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we can also have a robustness check where we just do the analysis for the time period before 2009 to kind of also avoid, because in the financial crisis, there was less emigration, so our instrument was not that strong. And we see that if we only look at before 2009, the effects are actually stronger.
Yvonne, can I ask a question also?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, it seems like you have a very, I don't know, strong assumption in general. I don't know if you need it for everything, but that if I'm a plumber in Poland, well, that's a bad example. If I'm a high skilled worker in Poland, that I'm going to go to the UK and work in the same industry.
Yeah.
And that's, I mean, can you see that can you test that in the data? And is that realistic? I mean, my impression is that most people downgrade quite a bit when they come from Eastern Europe.
No, that's a very good point. Unfortunately, we don't see in which industry they work in the origin country. So we just observe them in the destination country. So I cannot show you like a perfect test. One argument is that our industries are rather broad. It's 2 digits, so it's something like construction. So I completely believe that people are downgrading, but we think that you would downgrade within the same industry. So while in Poland you were a construction manager, maybe in the UK you would be a construction worker. If you still don't 100% believe that people are staying in the same broad industry, there is some literature which is not coming from migration, which is coming from industry switches within a given country, where they say that usually the industry switches happen at the 4-digit level, but not at the 2-digit level. So that is kind of comforting because our industries are rather big at the 2-digit. And then lastly, we thought about it. So if we really would observe a lot of industry switching, this would bias our results towards 0. So that would mean that we would underestimate the effect. But we think because of the industry structure is rather broad, we are a bit less worried about that.
Okay, but that has trade-offs for the interpretation of adjustment also, having a broad industry structure. So I'll wait till I see more what you're doing in that part to ask, but I think that's, I mean, that makes it very complicated to think about how firms respond also if you have very broad industries in a sense. But if you're focusing more on the firms, maybe that's less important.
Yeah, so construction is one industry. The others are more like manufacturing of electronics or manufacturing of chemical equipment. So the manufacturing is more disaggregated than the construction.
Okay.
Okay. Let me move on. Where's our data coming from? We have 3 main parts. One is the laws, and this is pretty straightforward. It just comes from EU legislation, and luckily there's a nice database that summarizes all this labor legislation changes. Our immigration data was more complicated. So there is no existing data set that has industry and is country of origin specific. So from the Eurostat labor force surveys, for example, you can see the industry, but they don't give you the country of origin, they give you country aggregates. So we had to go to the individual statistical offices in the 19 destination countries and request the number of immigrants that work in a certain industry in a certain year. A couple of countries, mostly the Northern Europeans, have really nice administrative data. A couple of other countries gave us the data from their labor force surveys. And for a few countries, we had to proxy with a general distribution of East European migrants in a given sector. The firm productivity data comes from a firm level data set called Orbis and Amadeus, which is provided by a private company called Bureau van Dijk, which is usually there used for financial analysis. And it's really nice because you can have the administrative data, so to say, from the firm's balance of payment and profit loss statements. And this is not targeting only the large or the listed companies, but it's targeting all firms with at least one employee. Now, the empirical specification. The main estimations are two-stage least square estimates, where we regress our 3 different measures of firm productivity on the emigrants in a given industry, origin and year. And this is instrumented with the free labor mobility variable. We have a couple of controls for firm age. We control for GDP and FDI to capture general economic effects, for value added and skill shortages in the destination and the industry level, and for investment and import share and the origin industry time level. And this we lag by 1 year to avoid the bad control problem. Then we have time firm fixed effects, unless later when I specifically say we don't have firm but industry fixed effects. But the main
sorry, Yvonne,
yes.
Do you only keep firms which are there for your whole period? How is this panel of firms? So firm appear and disappear, is unbalanced?
Yes, it's unbalanced. We take firms that have at least 2 observations, 2 subsequent observations.
And do you know if the attrition of firms is related to the immigration? So given that you don't look at how this immigration affects entry and exit, couldn't there be an effect through kind of selection of firm via entry and exit? I mean, I would assume that immigration should affect firm. There are fewer people, there should be fewer firm eventually.
No, definitely. And that's what we also find. So I'll first present the firm level results. And here, because we have firm fixed effects, we cannot control for the composition. But we have also, in the case of exit, we have the firm if it was observed in 2 years. So we are missing the firms which have only 1 single observation. On average, we have 5 years per firm. And the average age of a firm is 8 years. What we don't have is missing entries, basically entrepreneurship. So this we don't have. And this is why in a couple of slides, I show you how the firm level estimations differ from the industry level estimations. And there you see exactly what you suspect. So the main result is in column 4, 5, and 6. Column 1, 2, 3 is just for comparison, the OLS. And you can see that a 1% increase in emigrants corresponds to around 1.2% decrease in firm productivity. It's actually not very different for TFP, labor productivity, and wage productivity. And just to put the magnitude a little bit in perspective, so this reduction in firm productivity in 1 year is roughly similar to the reduction in firm productivity caused by the financial crisis. It is large, but it's also short term. So we find this in the year of emigration and in the subsequent year, and then it slowly gets back to normal. So we have a large sudden shock because the people have left.
Sorry, Yvonne.
Yeah.
Just to interpret that as productivity, what do you need to assume regarding demand for the output of those firms? So in particular, demand to non-tradables. Do you have a sense of where those emigrants remit money that would still then contribute to local demand, or do you rather think it's just as a pure factor movement and the demand side just stays constant?
That's a good point. So it depends. If you assume that the demand in general increases, let's say someone leaves a certain industry and then demand for food and housing and all these kind of things increase. If it's not industry specific, then I think this would be captured by the fixed effects. If it's industry specific, then we control for investment at the country industry time level. And if it's more about competition and demand factors, that the demand changes because of emigration, we control for the import share. So in that sense, this is more from the product side. So if there are certain products which are coming maybe from Western Europe now, then this is the demand for the product changes. So these are our strategies, how we try to solve that. So then we are looking at other firm outcomes. The variables we have in the data are costs per employee, capital labor ratio, and number of employees. And we don't find much, basically. And there could be a number of different reasons for this. So that's why we go into the heterogeneity analysis. So one thing we thought is interesting is to study if different firms along the initial productivity distribution. So we take the productivity distribution before 2004 and analyze the different effects. So here you can see that while the three productivity measures, we have a significant decline for all firms along the productivity distribution. And it doesn't matter very much if it's high or low productive firms. For the other variables, it's pretty close to zero. There are some differences along the productivity distribution, but I wouldn't overinterpret them. One nice thing is that if you look, this is the contemporaneous effect. If you look at the 1 year later, you can see slight effects that the more productive firms, so for the 10th percentile, the productivity, we can see that the effects are slightly smaller. To some extent, they are statistically significant, giving us some hints that the most productive firms are faster in adapting. And if you look, for example, you can see some differences for cost of employees and for number of employees. So for example, the most productive firms after 1 year don't have a decrease in the number of employees. And this probably means that they can substitute with other workers. You might wonder what is happening at the lowest productivity of the firms. And here we are thinking that there are some selection effects because exactly like Giovanni mentioned with the exit, so the lowest productivity firms have the highest probability to leave. So those that are remaining, basically that we still observe a couple of years later, are those that had high growth. Maybe these are the entrepreneurs which managed to survive. And that's why the number of employees has increased. We can also look at innovating firms. So these
Sorry, Yvonne, can I ask you a question before? So how do you interpret this Y divided by WL? I'm not sure what it's supposed to measure, the income relative to wage return? I mean, it seems like if labor is paid marginal productivity, that thing should not change. So are you saying it must depend on the markup structure of the firm? I'm not sure why. So you're saying essentially that emigration also decreases the share of labor in output, in value added, if Y divided by WL decreases. And that's not just productivity effect or increasing. It must have an assumption on the share of the surplus that goes to labor. Must have to do with market structure. I'm not, even in the model, when you put it up, I'm not sure what you want to capture with that.
So I think we capture that. Let me get. So one thing where you would see lower labor productivity is that if the best employees are leaving. I think that's the most likely event. And let's assume that the best workers, they have a higher chance to emigrate because they have higher chance to find work abroad. Mm-hmm. And if the best employees are leaving, then value added per employee, let's assume that those that left had a higher contribution to the value added. And if those are leaving, then the value added per employee should decrease. I think this is our most...
Yes, but if the wage per employee is proportional to the value added per employee, that won't happen. I think you must have an assumption that these people are also able to bargain better and get a larger share. There must be something in there. I think you need to... it's not... move on.
I mean, we do have... Maybe this goes in the direction of firm-specific human capital, which is not captured in wages. And we are trying, I will speak a bit about firm-specific human capital in a bit. Because we think actually it's firm-specific human capital, which is not fully captured in wages. But before I come to that, let me briefly show you the dynamic effects. So I have mentioned that in the year of the emigration, the effects are the strongest, and we still find strong effects 1 year later. But then the effects seem to recover because probably firms can recruit new workers, they can train them, they can learn by doing, and then after 2 years, the effects are basically zero. Now, briefly, the difference between firm level and industry level. So here you can see that the industry level is lower. And these are I think some of the reasons I mentioned a bit earlier is that we have the exit and the entry of firm. And just the example of an entry of firm. So let's assume we have a lack of entry. In the year of emigration, we actually would assume that the entrants have low productivity because they have just started, and there's evidence in the literature that in the first 1-2 years, and new entering firms have low productivity. So if they are lacking, we would expect that the industry levels are less negative than the firm level effects, which is what we find in year 1 and 0. But now if entrants are missing, typically after a couple of years, let's say after 2-3 years, those entrants have high productivity growth. And we are lacking this high productivity growth in year 2 and 3, where we see that the effects are negative, whereas for the firm level, they have already recovered. So this is one of the reasons why how we explain the difference between the firm and the industry level. The other reason is due to the exit of the least productive firms. And another thing is here in the industry level regressions, we weigh by employment. So we give stronger weight to firms that have more employment, and there can be some industry reallocation, whereas on the left side, just a firm is a firm. So I have 5 minutes to tell you the mechanisms, that I can do that briefly. So like I alluded a bit earlier, we think the most likely mechanism is a loss of firm-specific human capital. And we think that one argument is that all three firm productivity measures drop. So it's not just about reallocation capital labor. And there's lower incentives among firms to invest in training because of the increased turnover. So if the manager knows that my new hired person is likely to leave again because of the emigration opportunities, why should I invest in training? And these are two things we find. I mean, we don't have a measure of firm-specific human capital, unfortunately, but we have a measure of skill shortages and of job-related training from European Union surveys. And we can see at the industry level that firms that are exposed to larger emigration experience more skill shortages. And we have evidence that there's less job-related training from the EU LSF. So this gives us some hints about the mechanisms, but we don't have perfect data, unfortunately, for the mechanisms. One other nice thing is, which sheds some lights on the mechanism, is some evidence from the self-selection of immigrants. So in a perfect world, we would observe the education. But unfortunately, when we observe the data sets where we observe industry, we don't observe education. So we use a proxy, and we use the insights from the Roy-Bocha selection model. And we divide country pairs and emigration into two types. One, where the income is more dispersed in the destination compared with the origin, and one where the income is more dispersed in the origin. So initially, I was also a bit skeptical if this is really driving emigration, but the results are really intuitive. So if we use the Gini coefficient to create these two options, and then we separate the free labor mobility into two, exposure to positively selected migration and exposure to negatively selected immigration, we can see that the effects for positive selection are much stronger, especially in Y/L, which does not capture the wage effects, which doesn't measure very well if it's positive or negative selection because it doesn't have wages. What is also super interesting, we think, is that if you have positive selection, you have negative costs per employee, or negative, like costs per employee are shrinking. Why? Because those with higher wages have emigrated. Whereas in the case of negative selection, you have a positive effect on the cost per employee because the higher skilled or the better selected people are staying, and those are the ones with higher wages. So higher wage workers are staying and lower wage workers have emigrated. So we found this quite nice evidence that there might be our selection actually covers the real selection effect. The similar argument is about the capital labor ratio and the number of employees. Just the last minute on robustness checks. So our estimations are robust to a couple of different things. We change the sample composition, for example, only incumbents, only before the financial crisis. It's also robust to a couple of changes in the empirical specification. An event study is not perfect because our events are continuously happening, like the staggered opening, but at least we can say that there's no pre-trends. We can estimate it in differences, and we can account for serial correlation. We can use a couple of different aspects in the first stage, like change the weighting structure, and we can do placebo tests, like there's no effect of future labor market openings on current productivity. And if you look at other firm level constraints, such as high competition, the effects are zero and the first stage doesn't work. So let me conclude that the results we find are negative productivity effects in the short run, in 2 years. And actually, if you compare our numbers to aggregate IMF numbers, the IMF has estimated that emigration has reduced annual population growth by up to 1 percentage point, which has led to GDP reduction of around 1 percentage point. And the most affected countries are Romania, Latvia, and Lithuania. They had the largest emigration. And firms with at least one patent, I'm not sure if I've shown you now, but firms with at least one patent have been more successful in adjusting to free labor mobility. So they have increased the capital labor ratio and the wages, and they have not experienced negative productivity results. One could come up with a couple of policy implications basically about increasing the skills of the existing labor force, increasing the labor force participation of women, encouraging return migration with tax incentives, or immigration from countries that are further east like Ukraine and Belarus. Yeah, I leave it here. Thanks a lot for your attention. We are looking forward to your comments, and if you are a junior economist, then check out our workshop in September. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Yvonne, for your presentation. And so I'm going to open it up to question comments from the panel and from also the attendees. If you write in the chat or in the question that you have a question, we can let you ask. Questions are open.
So in one of the early descriptive graphs that you've shown, it looked like selection becomes increasingly positive over time. Yeah, those diagonal plots. Still, the effects that you show are pretty short-lived and then go back. So given that descriptive path, wouldn't you expect a more continuous negative effect if it becomes more selective over time? It was an early graph that I'm referring to, one of those scatter plots.
So we think that the firms adjust, they hire new people, they invest, they hire new people, and they have some learning by doing and some training, not the same training they would have without immigration, but we think that there is this adjustment. Which graph did you mean with the increasing positive selection?
Pretty much at the beginning, you had those scatter plots, I think 2005, 10, and 15 or something.
This one. I wouldn't interpret it as really increasing over time positive selection. I think positive selection has been pretty much there.
But that's something that I think we can have a look at. So because also the dynamic effects, they're not capturing the effects, let's say, over time, comparing the effect in 2004 and then the effect in 2008 and 10. It's rather the average effect, let's say the average 1 year effect over our 16-year period. So in this case, but that's an interesting point that we could consider.
Also, unfortunately, this data here ends in 2010 because the data set from ERB ends in 2010. So we don't know exactly what is happening in 2015, if the positive selection is becoming more severe or not. But we can check this out in detail.
Yvonne, I also had a question. I was wondering if you guys looked at all between splitting up, like try to split trade. It comes back to a question that Simon asked before too, about maybe looking at tradables versus non-tradables. Because I mean, most of the papers that have, I mean, I think you're the first paper to do this for emigration, but obviously there's a nice literature on the impact of immigration on firms. And most of them have found very different, effects for tradable and non-tradable sectors. I mean, especially in how they adjust. And I do think it's important to think, I mean, with such a large emigration episode, you would think that there are a lot of things that are changing. I mean, you're maybe having new trade with, you're in a it's not just that, you're also opening up markets for these firms too, right? So, I mean, firms in Latvia and Lithuania have new markets that they can sell to. They have the immigrants who are sending money back. So I do think it's it's probably important to think about that. I'll let you, I had a second question too. It's more of a suggestion. I'm trying to think how much you really gain from, I'm wondering if you would benefit, or maybe it would be a secondary analysis where you focus on just one or two particular countries, potentially where you have better data, in the sense that I would, from the country themselves. I understand why you didn't try and do it for 14 countries, But you would have some countries where you would be able to have very good data about who's left the country from the country's own statistics, right? So if you focused on a country like Romania, which has had probably the biggest shock, you could look at labor force data for Romania, see which Romanians have left, and then maybe try to relax some of these assumptions about, I mean, I think your instrument doesn't need occupations or industries. I mean, you could just say, you know, certain countries open up, that causes a big shock of Romanians to leave. It varies by skill level. And then you can estimate, you know, sort of, you know, how does that affect different firms that employ different skilled workers? I mean, at least for me, I think it would be a much cleaner identification strategy. I mean, I don't know about, I just think the occupation side of things makes things very difficult because of all of these other, or industry, sorry, not occupation, but all of these other nexuses, like industries now having new access to foreign markets also. So I mean, that's not a question to answer, I guess, but it's just something that I think it's something worth thinking about.
Yeah, thanks. These are very interesting comments. So tradables versus non-tradables, I think that's something we can do in the heterogeneity analysis. So I'm not too worried about this being a threat to identification, because we have a couple of controls that would capture imports, for example. But I think it's an interesting heterogeneity, as you said, like in parallel to the immigration literature. The one or two countries, I think it's a matter of taste. If you do it for one country, people will tell you it lacks external validity. But also another problem could be that our instrument is very nice because different countries open up at different times, and we can then control for country fixed effects, or like we can control for country industry fixed effects, or we can have this GDP, and we have more variation, which allows us to have more controls. If we do it at the country level, it might be more difficult because for Romanians, for example, we don't have that for Romania, Ireland is more important than Italy because it's just Romania. Whereas if we have 14 countries, we have this really nice addition to the first stage that the Baltics are more affected from the Norway opening than Portugal. So I think having 14 countries really gives us really nice variation in the first stage. But yeah, of course, it comes at a cost that you cannot have like this administrative matched employer-employee data, which you could maybe for a specific country. Maybe a second paper.
Yvonne, I have a simple question. So you have collected data on the distribution of workers from your origin countries across industries in the destination. And I would like to know to what extent their distribution is consistent with the opening policies set by the destination. So do you see a lot of immigrants where they shouldn't be?
So we might have to do a graph on that. But I think, isn't our first stage answering this question? Because let's assume there would be a lot of immigrants in the sectors which have not opened, then our first stage would kind of break down, right? So given that we do see that people are emigrating exactly to the sectors and countries that are opening in this year, I think our first stage kind of is the summary of this. Of course, it's not perfect. Of course, there's still a few workers coming to Germany, because if you have a work contract and if you maybe get reallocated from a multinational company that is both important in Germany, so there are still ways, also maybe researcher visa. So there's still some types of employment which are possible even when a sector is closed. There's also always some exceptions. I mean, there's also people that have emigrated in 2003 when the countries were not part of the EU. So there are a few exceptions, but the large majority is influenced by the openings, because this is our strong first stage. That's what I would say. But maybe we could do some graphical analysis or something.
Thanks.
Yvonne, related to this, so the concept that you're using of selective migration or this Teroi model based idea is a bilateral selection, right? So you compare the inequality of origin and destination, but then the outcome are in only, they have to be aggregated by country of origin, whatever the destination is. So I didn't understand what it means when you separate between the positively selected. So Bulgaria may have positively selected migrant to Germany, but negatively selected to Italy, depending on the relative. So I didn't understand how you then collapse this into just the origin, and you still have some positively selected origin and positively and negatively selected ones.
So we divide the dummies. So we have 19 dummies, right? 90 potential destinations.
Mm-hmm.
And we use, in the case of positive selection, just the dummies which indicate as positive selection. So we basically divide the destination dummies into those that would predict positive and those that would predict negative selection.
Sorry, but isn't this also origin specific?
Yeah.
Yeah, and the instrument is also origin specific. So
The instrument, I mean, each term I understand, but then you have to collapse them to get just the total pool, total effect on an industry in Latvia. You have to aggregate all the pool factor from any of the 19 destinations. So I wasn't sure how you can divide the results, which are by country of origin in an industry, into positively and negatively selected, when you have a bilateral concept that then, though, when you aggregate by origin, there could be a mixture of the two. Or maybe I'm not understanding exactly what you're doing there.
So we just basically, for those where we have positive selection, we are just using those dummies in the aggregation. We're just using those dummies where we would expect positive selection. So basically the instrument is just constructed with openings that would lead to a positive selection. And in the case of negative, yeah.
I see. So you construct to separate an instrument every time. I see. Okay. I see. Okay. And I think we're getting to the end of the 1 hour, which was scheduled. So I think we have to wrap it by thanking again Yvonne and Nadzeya for this very interesting presentation and a very stimulating paper. And thank you all the participants. Thank you all the panel. Thank you everybody. This was wonderful.
Bye.
Thanks for all your feedback and the comments. That was very helpful.
Bye.
Bye.
thank you. Bye-bye.